system are treated like a toy. Ideas are misunderstood, but brilliance is his point. Benefactor boy, can't you hear his voice? Talking about 0 point, the points lost on them. Kevin structures crumbling from the same old stem. They laugh like I'm crazy, but I see it all so clear. Exploited labor, unnerving justice, burning ears. Fighting for a change in this wasteland of noise. But they call me foolish, whining shed boys. Benefactor boy, dreaming about the world begin to play. Changing the system, but treated like a toy. Ideas misunderstood, but brilliance is his point. Benefactor boy, can't you hear his voice? Chasing revolutions in the darkest nights. A dreamer with vision beneath the laughter and noise. A future so bright waiting for the right choice.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to Beneficence TV Live. This is the Benefactor's Guide to Free Energy Devices. My mic is working a little bit better than I expected. Interesting. All right, I'm your lovable host, the Benefactor, and tonight we're exploring a discovery that kind of flips conventional circuitry thinking on its head. We're talking about electron flow, dipole preservation, asymmetric circuits, and the hidden synergy between forward current and back EMF. By the end of this episode, you'll see how circuits can operate in ways that seem impossible, preserving energy that conventional theory says should be lost. First, I want to give a quick recap on my coil updates from last night for those who missed it. Set this down right there. All right, so last night we hit a major turning point in the development of our vortex coil system. What started out as a simple experiment turned into a full breakdown of back EMF dynamics, synthetic AC, dipole preservation, and to be completely honest, it might be a brand new concept strongly related to, or even already a part of the plasmoid unification model, maybe something that Malcolm hasn't already explained yet, but I call it field cavitation. And here's the compressed version of last night's summary at least. When we hooked up the 40-watt panel, when we disconnected the 40-watt panel, and monitored the output with the oscilloscope, I noticed the system jumped to 2 kilohertz on the frequency. Now, I normally don't pay attention to the frequency because it's really tiny and in the corner, and sometimes I forget to pay attention to it, to be honest. But I paid attention to it this time, and when I disconnected the load, it jumped from 1 kilohertz, which is what it usually rings at with the 40-watt panel connected, and the resonance range I thought it was. It jumped up to 2 kilohertz. As displayed on our oscilloscope. So that told us a few things. It told us that 2 kilohertz is probably the coil's natural resonant peak, not 1 kilohertz. So we were off by a whole kilohertz. The load drags it down to 1 kilohertz, so it's not the ideal load. And tuning the load to hold that 2 kilohertz range might actually unlock even bigger efficiency gains. So this actually also confirms the system does behave like a high Q resonance device, and not just some simple transistor oscillator that they classify the Joule thief as. So the back EMF is the real driver of the circuit here, but it's not driving the load. And that's the interesting thing that we found out. Okay, so the negative rail, we monitored the output, right? The negative rail is getting negative 168 volts. This is just from 12 volt DC battery, 20 amp hour, by the way. But the positive rail was surprising even more with only 10 positive volts. The analog meters were even more confusing. Both modes, the DC and AC modes, which are capable of handling up to 500 volts, they were both reading off the charts, right? The needle was wanting to go past what it was able to. So this tells us that the back EMF dominates the system, but it's not powering the load. The forward EMF powers the load. The collapsing pulse returns to the negative terminal of the battery like I have it connected from the negative rail. So this slows the discharge, and instead of, what people normally attempt to do is recharge the battery while it's, powering the device. This is not recharging the battery. It's just slowing down the decay. So this is our first evidence of clear dipole preservation. It's very exciting news. Very exciting developments. What's going on, Society of High Sciences? How you doing? Again, everything I talk about here on this podcast, they're mostly theories about the coil. We really don't know exactly what's going on. We can only guess based off of our scientific data and observations. And that's just what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to put the pieces together. I could be wrong on some stuff. I could be wrong on all of it. At the end of the day, progress is the only thing that's important. I don't give a shit if I'm wrong 1,000 times. As long as I'm right that one time, we can progress forward. So going back to our updates from last night, when the load was removed, I swear to God, I smelled a burning smell. And I don't exactly know what ozone is supposed to smell like, but I smelt it really strong right when the load was, well, actually it was only a few seconds, like maybe 2 seconds after the load was disconnected and I turned on the power to the system. It was humming for maybe 2 seconds, and then I smelled a real strong burning smell. My AC, kicked in at the same time, the heat. Sometimes it does make a burning smell, but that's usually when I haven't turned it on for a long time. It's been running for a while, and I haven't smelt that for a while from the unit. So it was immediately like, is this the heater or is this the coil? But then I shut it off, and it immediately went away. So I'm like, okay, this has to be the coil producing that smell. So I'm strongly convinced that there was some kind of ozone, maybe not a lot, but some kind of ozone coming out from the coil in closed circuit mode nonetheless. So this tells us that ionization could be happening. When the coil has no load, remember, it's producing what I classify as a true resonance cascade, right? It's a cascading effect of resonance buildup that has nowhere to go, has nowhere to dump itself. The hum becomes loud as a consequence, right? There's violent interference, destructive interference that's happening. Ionization occurs at the center of the coil where the magnetic flux is condensed, and the ozone smell starts to appear. So this is classic high field collapse behavior, by the way. It ties directly into the plasmoid phenomenon that Malcolm Bendel describes in his plasmoid unification model. We did try hooking up a capacitor and a resistor to the positive side of the battery terminal to try to smooth out and recharge the battery. However, we did get it to charge up to like, although we did get it to charge up to like 8 volts, we wanted to see it higher than the battery. Ideally we wanted around 13, 14 volts. And with a negative 168 volts, that's totally possible. But we were only getting 8 volts. And I was like, what the hell's going on? So after going over the data and realizing we're only getting plus 10 volts on the positive side, and that's the only thing going to the load, that explains why it doesn't light as bright as it can. It defaults to like a more low setting. We've tuned it so it's probably around 10% bright for a 40-watt panel. Though, 10% brightness should not be consuming only 15 millivolts per hour on the battery. It should last 12.2 watt hours with this kind of system. Should only last about 4 or 5 hours under ideal conditions, assuming 100% efficiency. So in this last 15 plus hours. So we have to really ask the question, where is that extra power coming from? Now people suggested, it's the duty cycle. You're just, you just have a really, really high low duty cycle. No, we checked the duty cycle with the oscilloscope. It was getting 50-50, in most cases 60-40, but in some cases 50-50. So it wasn't the duty cycle. So we made a critical error putting that cap bank, well, technically it's just a capacitor. I had to make a bank because I didn't have the voltage requirement for the capacitor. I had a 1,000 microfarad cap, but it was only rated to 16 volts, and I was assuming, because it was registering about 20 extra volts, I didn't see all that negative voltage. So we're gonna have to up the rating now that I think about it, but it was only rated to 16 volts. We wanted to up that rating, so I kind of put 2 of them in series, 2 of them in parallel, and connected those as kind of like a cap bank, a makeshift cap bank. And we put that in series with a resistor to the positive. But this was the mistake. I didn't notice at the time, until I went over the data later, that all of the power was coming from the negative, and all of it was being already dumped back into the battery on the negative side, because remember, when I first started doing these experiments, I was messing with things and trying to experiment and figure out different, more efficient ways of handling the current. And I was like, okay, well, let's try disconnecting the negative. Because I think I'd accidentally disconnected it before and it was still running. I'm like, how is it still running? So we disconnected the negative, and then I just have it grounded and the return path connected through the negative output. So you basically have a branch from the emitter path of the transistor, right, going out to the output, just basically back to ground. And that's how you would normally ground the system anyways. In the breadboard version of the circuit, you have to do it that way. The circuit doesn't actually have a return path for the input. That's how you do it. So this is very interesting. You guys can actually do this yourself if you have one of these coils right now. And I show you how to do it. We went through the process. I walked you through the process of building the actual circuit a couple of nights ago on the podcast. We have the do-it-yourself guide that I provided in the description of this video. And of course, you can always email me or comment and question if you have any questions. So this is a working theory, but it all kind of explains these weird things that we've been seeing, and these things that we've been seeing with the coil, this phenomenon. This phenomena is really like kind of contradicting itself in a way when you compare it to, you know, the mainstream story of how electrodynamics operates. But we're going to go into this in a little bit, in a few minutes. We're looking at circuits the wrong way. And I know Nathan from Old Man Builds has talked about this. Mike Does from his channel has talked about this. You know, you got to be thinking about where how the electrons are actually moving. And for some reason, we put together the conventional flow of circuits before we discovered that the flow was actually flowing in the opposite direction. So what happened was we put together the conventional theory of flow for electronics that says the flow is from positive to negative, right? But that's not actually true. We've discovered after the fact that the flow of electrons is actually from negative to positive. Now, this is interesting because why wouldn't they, you know, the scientific community is very rigid about changing their opinion when they find empirical evidence that contradicts earlier evidence, right? And, except key sectors that kind of impede the progress of the petrodollar system. And what I mean by that is, you know, capitalism, basically capitalist interest involved in, you know, academia, for instance, in the Egyptian affair that doesn't want to admit that they could be wrong. So there are all these factors that go into, you know, why they didn't change this way of thinking, but we still operate under the conventional flow theory when building our circuits. And in my opinion, you can't do it that way if you want to really understand how to get the most power out of the system, because you're going to be making mistakes along the way. You have to trace the path of energy from the negative to the positive, and you got to think about it in a different way. All right, so going back to our theory on trying to close the loop in our system, either partially or fully, I don't know if it's even possible to fully close the loop on this kind of a system, but I know it's definitely partially possible because we've already done it. We've already partially closed the loop already, By hooking that negative up, I monitored the drainage on the battery, and it clearly went down, meaning the decay rate slowed. So that's, kind of definitive proof. Like, okay, so we fed some extra energy back into the battery without affecting the light, without affecting the output. So that tells us of something very important, that we can partially close the loop and maybe even increase the efficiency of that partially closed loop by adding, say, a capacitor and a resistor like we were trying to do, only on the negative rail this time, and trying to smooth out some of that energy going in there. Because as of now, it's kind of just like really dirty energy going in there, really unclean, really hard and distorted spikes of energy. We want a smooth, clean input to the battery, right? And that'll give us the maximum amount of, efficiency, really, or that's what I'm hoping for. So this goes back to the dipole preservation, or if it turns out to be the preservation of the dipole is a major discovery in the system. So if this is true, we can think of it as the back EMF goes back to the battery's negative terminal to slow down the discharge. It doesn't recharge the battery. It's slowing the discharge rate. It's kind of supplementing any of that normal loss that you would see in the system with the back EMF. So the forward EMF goes to the load. That's the only thing that goes to the load, or at least most of it goes to the load. Maybe it gets a little bit of back EMF. I don't know. But it appears to be only 10 positive volts going to the load. But together, they kind of produce what I call a synthetic AC, and an energy recycling system. Now, synthetic AC is nothing new. We have similar effects in, say, resonant converters, where they're doing, back EMF capture. The difference is that they do not differentiate this kind of AC with normal AC. And that's the mistake, in my opinion. When you're dealing with the synergy between two different kind of energies, you want to classify it as a different kind of waveform, right? And we've classified this specific one as a resonant pulse waveform. It produces a synthetic AC between the pulsed back and forward EMF chasing each other with correct timing and geometry. Now, this is very important because we want to make a distinction between synthetic AC and regular AC, which is just forward current sloshing back and forth. Now, why this isn't like in its own category, I have no idea. But it needs to be. And it clearly needs to be because it has some unique effects, especially when you can branch off the forward to the load and divert the back EMF back towards the negative terminal of the battery. Now, so why did the diode then boost the brightness? And I was trying to wrap my head around this, and you have to really kind of think about the energy flow in a different way, and that makes you think about the components in a different way, really. Now, the high-speed diode on the positive rail actually blocks the negative collapse from hitting the load. So what you have here is, in conventional flow, you're thinking, or at least I was before, oh, the forward EMF is coming from the positive, and then the back EMF is coming from the negative when it collapses. But no, when you think about how the electricity actually flows, the forward is coming from the negative. So that must mean the back EMF is coming from the positive. Now this explains a lot, because this means that diode that's with the anode facing the positive and the cathode facing the load, that means that back EMF is going to be diverted back to the battery. And what that also means is that this also forces the forward EMF towards the load. So it kind of splits them off. And this produces somewhat of a clean forward pulse to the LED panel. And this explains why the LED panel got brighter. And we can actually probably do some measurements with and without the resonance relay tonight, if we have time. Yeah, depending on our time factor and when we finish up here, we might be able to sneak some mini lab testing in. But either way, it did get brighter when you put the diode on the positive rail. So it obviously did something. And this makes the most sense. You know, these LED panels are meant to work with the forward EMF. So it doesn't make sense that it's, you know, just using... Like, at first I thought it was using the synergy between the back and forward in the load. But, you know, the more I think about it, the more I think, okay, well, it's going to perform optimally just with the forward. Because that's how the panel's designed. That's what these engineers are thinking about conventionally when they design these circuits. So it's not going to handle the back EMF very well, even if it's a resonant, you know, pulsed waveform like we have. So why is it handling the energy so well inside the light? Well, that makes the most sense, right? It's splitting off the back EMF from the forward at that diode. And then the back EMF is being redirected back to the battery's negative terminal because that is its path of least resistance. Again, it'll go back up to that output, right? The negative output. And you have, it has the choice of going to the load, the negative of the load, or the negative of the battery. And it's going to go back to the battery. It's going to go home. So this got me thinking, what's really going on in these systems? Why is it getting so much net extra energy, or appearing to get so much net extra energy while I can't actually measure it, but I can see it? You know, I can see the secondhand effects of it. I can see the odd behavior of the system as it's adjusted. Well, that got me thinking about Malcolm Bendel's plasmoid unification model, and whether he has this conceptually in his model or not, I don't know. It could very well be a part of his model, but I still want to put it out there in case somebody hasn't thought of it. But it's a theory that the fields are doing the cavitation. So this is field cavitation theory, which was kind of the biggest breakthrough I had in my understanding of how this system could be operating. So it is now my belief that field cavitation might just be the underlying mechanism at play here with these coils, and it plays out like the EM cousin of bubble cavitation. So in water, when bubbles collapse small enough, right? I think 1 to 2 microns. If they collapse small enough, they collapse symmetrically. And with enough pressure, it creates a pressure spike and light. This is the sololuminescence experiment, the star in a jar experiment. This is actually producing energy. It's producing a plasmoid. Or a So in the coil, though, we have a similar effect to what's going on as described by Malcolm Bendel in his plasmoid unification model. We have magnetic field collapse producing what I believe could be an electromagnetic void, because we have two counter-rotating electromagnetic fields placed on top of each other in such a way that they compress on a 0 point in between them, the equatorial plane between them. They kind of pinch at a point. This is called the 0 point. Now that could be forming a void where field cavitation could be taking effect, similar to bubble cavitation, which explains, you know, the large negative spikes we see in the system and the ionization of the coil. Whether I smelt ozone or not, we do know for a fact these coils produce massive amounts of ozone at very low voltages, and you just don't get that in any other system unless you have actual, like, plasma discharge, like corona discharge, or arcing of some kind. Like very high voltages, I think the minimum is like 1,000 volts. In traditional systems, you'll start to get ionization and then ozone. Michel Morel, my mentor and lab partner, he got it at like 80 volts. So that's the difference here. This system is able to ionize that at a very low voltage compared to traditional systems. Why is that? Maybe the fields are collapsing in on each other in such a way that they are creating field cavitation, and plasmoid structures might be forming, helping to improve the system's efficiency. We have the geometry, the switching speed, and the back EMF routing, that all create the exact conditions for, these kinds of effects. Theoretically, at least. Remember, these are just theories. So this really does become a bridge, though, if this is proven correct, to be a bridge between the plasmoid unification model and actual, experimentation in the lab. And high Q asymmetric energy recycling systems. So we didn't actually just build a Joule Thief. We kind of modified it to be like a proto Bedini-Rodin hybrid system almost. It powers a load, right? It powers a load with forward EMF. It recycles the back EMF, preserving the dipole as it does so. It resonates at around 2 kilohertz and produces a synthetic alternating current between the forward and back EMF correctly timed. Now, and it also shows signs of field cavitation, or what could be described as field cavitation under the plasmoid unification model. So this does put us into genuine asymmetric energy territory here. We have some very unique effects going on with the system, and if you have the ability to replicate any of this, please do so. Please do so safely, but do so with my do-it-yourself guide in the description of this video and all my videos. So that is our summary of just last night's podcast. So in brief, last night I realized the system doesn't actually recharge the battery. So I kind of realized it might be preventing its discharging. So we have the forward EMF that actually powers the load itself, and it splits off from the back EMF at that diode, and the back EMF goes back towards the negative terminal on the battery, which could be preserving the dipole as evidence of the slower decay rate of the battery when I did so. I mean, again, there's a reason why I have it hooked up this way, and I don't have the negative hooked up on the input of the system. Like this negative wire right here, this brown wire, it's not even hooked up at all. This is normally where the negative of the battery would go. But I was thinking, wouldn't it be more efficient if we didn't have the return current go back through the fucking circuit and just go straight back to the battery? That's what I was thinking. I didn't have any idea that this could be preserving the dipole or recycling the energy back into the system like it is, until I really looked at the way the current was flowing, and I had to draw it out. Like I was at work drawing this out on a piece of paper, trying to figure out, okay, so the current's going this way and this way and this way, and the diode is preventing, and I had a revelation. I was talking to, the chat AI and Google AI and all sorts of different things, looking up things on Google, and I realized, yeah, it's splitting. And then I had Google AI and ChatGPT both confirm, yeah, that's possible. That's definitely possible. And I don't know if you noticed, but Google AI is notorious for being closed-minded. It's an AI that's programmed to only confirm what's peer-reviewed and in the mainstream. So it doesn't have the ability to think outside the box like something like ChatGPT, which pools all the information from the internet and kind of judges it all as a one, whereas Google AI won't even look at something like John Hutchinson's work or Malcolm Bendel's work as legitimate and weigh in as legitimate there. So if you have Google AI confirming something like this, it's a good sign that that's probably what's happening. So this was a big revelation. We also realized that the system should be aimed at 2 kilohertz rather than just 1 kilohertz, which, is kind of big information, because I don't know if you know this, but, tuning into the true resonance frequency, like you have a range for resonance, but then you have a specific frequency you can tune into, that's the peak. The peak, the cleanest, the purest, molto bella, the best resonance. So you want that peak resonance area where it's minimizing the destructive interference or maximizing the constructive. However you like to, whatever your philosophical bend. Are you a glass half full person or a glass half empty? So, with all that said, tonight we take the next step, right? We're gonna try to think about moving the cap to the negative rail. I don't have the equipment to do it yet, but I am going to order something on Amazon that should have a higher voltage rating. I'll probably get something around 200 volts, but I also want something like a kit, so I can try different capacitors. 'Cause I don't want to just order one, because if I'm wrong on that capacitance value, I'm gonna be very sad, because I'm gonna have to wait, another week or so before I can try the experiment again. So we want to order a kit so we can just try a bunch of different values. We'll start out at 1,000 microfarad though. I think that's a fair start, because we don't want it. We don't want the tank too big, right? We don't want to dump too much energy back in there all at once. We kind of want to ease our way back into it, just put our foot in the water just a little bit, just dip our toe in, just see how it reacts, right? What's up, Dennis Malkovich? Or Matovich, sorry. My bad. I said, yeah, I might have got my project. Cool. Even if it went to a second battery and not the primary, get a variable cap. Yeah, so that's an idea. Variable capacitor. We can get a variable cap, depending on the price range. That I did look into briefly. They're harder to find though, which is kind of why I was looking into making my own capacitors. Really, I kind of got inspired, especially with everything we know about asymmetric capacitors and what we read online the other day about the American Computer Company and how they claim to have like this super transfer cap. So that, I don't know, that all got me inspired. Capacitors aren't very difficult to make from what I understand. They're just two conductive materials with an insulated material, dielectric in between, and I got plenty access. I can source clay pretty easily. We can fire it up, make some ceramic, do some different shapes and designs. So maybe we'll talk to Malcolm and see what he recommends for the shape of our capacitor, because the size and dimensions are probably going to affect the system quite a bit. As he notes from the plasmoid unification model, everything goes back to geometry, form and function, right? So, yeah. All right. So, moving on to today's lecture on dipole preservation. Right? This is something that I had to learn recently. And it's something I'm still wrapping my head around. But most people are taught, and I was taught, that electricity flows from positive to negative. This is a confusing tale of conventional teaching. All right? That's conventional current, right? That's conventional flow, and it's how nearly every textbook and schematic presents circuits. But it's even how we simulate them in the simulators, right? But in reality, the electrons flow from negative to positive. And this difference seems small, maybe even insignificant to somebody. But it's actually huge when it comes to understanding how energy actually moves. So, conventional teaching often leads people to ground the wrong parts out of their system, which destroys the dipole and wastes energy, right? The dipole is the potential between the negative and positive terminal of your source. You want that potential to remain a potential. You don't want it to stabilize into zero, because then you have no energy. The energy comes from that potential. If you can maintain that potential, you get more energy. So that's why so many experiments and free energy devices appear to, fail or not work. They're often neutralizing the energy that they're trying to use without even realizing it. And, it's probably something I did in the past. I'm almost certain of it. So last night, we observed something kind of remarkable. In our circuit, most of the negative voltage, about 168 volts, were turned directly to the negative terminal of the battery, while only a small portion, about 10 plus volts, goes to the load. Now this happens because of what I call an asymmetric branch at the diode. This prevents the electrons from flowing backwards, right, back towards the positive terminal. And here's the critical insight. Even though the forward current isn't returning to the positive terminal directly, the current still completes because the vacuum or the dipole preserving flow, the back EMF, naturally returns to the negative rail, which acts like a hidden bridge back to the battery. So this lets the load operate normally while keeping the dipole intact, so energy isn't wasted neutralizing the system. Because remember, where's that energy going to go once it goes through the load? The positive energy. It can't go back. It can't go back to the other. It's trapped inside the load. So it kind of dissipates after, I think, a quarter cycle or something. So there's a slight ripple, but it dissipates. So it's not going back to the battery. We're not returning the forward EMF back to the battery in the system. If you look at the schematics, and I'll pull them up in a minute, it's actually fucking insane when you actually draw out the energy flow of current for the forward EMF and the back EMF, and you say, oh, wait a second. The forward's not actually being returned to the battery here because we're tracing it from the negative, and it's not returning to the positive. It's just going from the negative to the diode back through the load. So I'm like, how is it even powering on? And I had to wrap my head around that. There's still some questions I have about how it's actually even able to start up. But it does. And it makes sense the more you think about it. Because that bridge is the back EMF connection back to the battery. Remember, we have a synergy effect between the forward and the back. That's the bridge, right? So you have the synergy between the forward and the back. And then when the back returns to the negative load after it's branched off, it's already bridged with the forward. So it's connected. There's your bridge. So it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. So, this all lets the load operate normally with just the forward EMF while keeping the dipole intact or intact longer. So energy isn't wasted in the system. So let's break this all down for a minute because it's a lot to digest, I know. So the forward current, the forward EMF, is electrons flowing from the battery's negative terminal through the load and powering the load. The back EMF, or vacuum flow of energy, instead of going through the load, this energy splits off at the diode and goes directly back to the negative terminal of the battery. It's not going to go back through the load because that's not the path of least resistance, because there is that branch right at the negative junction of the output where you have the negative output of the load, or negative of the load, negative output of the load, and then you have that also clipped off, grounded to the negative terminal. That's the return path. It's not going to go back to the load. It's going to go back to the battery because that's the path of least resistance here. That's where the energy wants to go back to. It wants to return to the battery. So instead of going to the load, it goes back to the battery. Then the diode actually controls this asymmetric split. The diode prevents the backflow of the positive terminal, forcing the back EMF to take the shortest path back, which is the negative terminal of the battery. So this interaction allows the circuit to feel complete from an electron flow perspective, right? Imagine yourself as a little electron, and in the fucking wire, you know, going. Okay, so imagine yourself as a little electron. This interaction allows you to understand that this circuit feels complete from an electron flow perspective because you have that bridge for the electron, even though the forward current isn't physically returning to the positive terminal. Now that's very important to wrap your head around, and it's not. Now, the back EMF, as I said before, acts like a bridge that completes this circuit without dissipating the forward energy unnecessarily. At least, you know, this is all my theory. This is my working theory of how this is actually working, and it makes sense the more you think about it. So think of it like a hidden dance between two complementary flows. The forward current powers the load. The back EMF preserves the dipole by returning energy back to the battery via negative terminal. Together, they create a synthetic alternating current-like cycle that keeps the circuit operational and energy preserving. So this has huge implications for free energy devices, radiant energy devices, all that. If this is true, this has massive implications. Because this points to a couple of things. Energy preservation. Most electrons never pass through the load conventionally. Energy is maintained instead of being wasted in the system. We're only directing just the amount of energy that we want to the load and nothing more. Everything else is getting recycled. It's not getting recycled clean, though. We need that capacitor. Remember, we need the capacitor to smooth out that return back to the negative terminal. Circuit longevity. This tells us that we can make circuits last a lot longer. Devices can run more efficiently since the dipole isn't constantly being drained and strained, rather, to meet that stability. Remember, nature's always trying to find balance. It wants to balance out the potential difference between the positive and negative terminals. We don't want it to balance out. We want to keep that separation. We want to keep the charge separation going because that's what keeps the energy flowing in your system. And if you can do that, and there are ways of doing that, you can, theoretically get, a COP greater of 1, which is pretty exciting. Synergy is key here. This teaches us that synergy is key. Timing and phase relationship between the forward current and back EMF ensures the system completes the circuit in a non-traditional way and maximizes its peak values. So this leads us to new design strategies. We want to think in terms of electron flow that allow unconventional grounding, asymmetric diode placement, and anything that, preserves energy in an unconventional way. Now, our measurements last night kind of confirm all this behavior, right? The negative 168 volts return to the negative on the output, while the positive is only getting 10 volts. The stored energy of roughly 12.2 watt hours of energy that should only last about 4 to 5 hours in this kind of system with the energy it's using. But thanks to the dipole preservation method and the forward back EMF synergy, the superposition between them, creating the synthetic AC, the circuit kind of operates it does operate far longer than, the calculations suggest it should, even at 100%. Even though we can't really gauge the actual efficiency of the system because the numbers just don't make sense. The measurements, I don't care who you are. John Bedini was right? The more I fucking try to read the efficiency of the system, the more baffled I get. Because at the end of the day, our measurements tools weren't made to measure this kind of energy. They weren't made to measure these kinds of circuits. We need to think differently. And we'll get into that in a minute. But these circuits can operate far longer than the calculations suggest they should, even at 100% efficiency. So This demonstrates the importance of considering electron flow and the hidden contributions of back EMF when predicting real-world performance. So what can you do with this insight? What can we do with this? Well, let's, for one, rethink grounding, okay? Rethink how you ground your system. Remember, it's good to design a circuit conventionally, but also get in the habit of retracing that energy movement from the negative to the positive as well. See if there are any unconventional or hidden pathways of energy return for that negative terminal if you're using back EMF. We can kind of take this insight and use diodes more strategically, that's for sure, right? Asymmetric diode branches appear to prevent backflow while redirecting the vacuum flow where it needs to go, back to the battery. So we're powering the load with just the forward, then we're sending all that extra back EMF that's, sloshing, in kind of rhythmic fashion, instead of going against in a destructive fashion. It's kind of being carried, right? And then in a way it's being carried instead of fighting the forward current. It's kind of being carried with that back and forth, and then gently being returned back to the battery where it wants to go. So we have to design electrons first with this insight. Preserving energy in the dipole instead of neutralizing it maximizes efficiency. We have to reevaluate calculations. Okay, standard energy math may underestimate the performance of these kinds of systems. That's just the reality here. These kinds of systems that are designed to preserve the dipole. Closed loop systems. So synergy awareness, right? The timing and interaction of forward and back EMF flows are critical here, right? Timing is major. Together they act to complete the circuit without dissipating energy unnecessarily. And I think the geometry of the rodent coil and its natural ability to just act as a resonant cavity real easily, that's the real key here, because the traditional coil, while you might be able to do this, it's going to be extremely hard compared to the rodent coil or the ABHA coil to tune into that resonance. Whereas here, we probably, in theory, have a larger area, larger frequency range for resonance that could be affected, right? Whereas a normal coil, a helically round coil, probably has a tighter range, and you have to really fine tune it. So I think that's probably the key takeaway here, and what people will find if they try to utilize this kind of method in a traditional helical coil. Not to say it's not possible. It probably definitely is possible. You probably just have to consider a finer, more precise tuning method for your system. Again, it's my belief that almost any coil has the ability to produce energy from the vacuum to be utilized, as recycled. But the difference is that they have to have at least two channels of counter-rotating energy. That's the key feature. You have to have the energy going in two directions at the same time to produce two counter-rotating electromagnetic fields that kind of produce that 0 point on the plane between them. So the big takeaway tonight is simple but profound, really. Energy doesn't always have to flow the way textbooks say, right? My headphone just died. Give me a second. So the big takeaway tonight is very profound, right? The energy doesn't always have to flow the way textbooks say it does. By understanding true electron movement from negative to positive, respecting the dipole's preservation, and harnessing the synergy between forward and back EMF, we can create circuits that operate in ways conventional theory would call impossible. This is why free energy and radiant energy systems have always seemed mysterious. They work outside of conventional assumptions. You have to go back to first principle thinking, like Malcolm Bendel emphasizes. And now we're finally seeing it clearly. These circuits, they can run efficiently Our dipole is clearly lasting longer with that negative connected than normal. And energy can be preserved in a controlled and intelligent way. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in and hanging out with me this evening. We still have so much to go over regarding these recent developments, right? So make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to get notified on all our revolutionary content. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into a lab today, but we will try to do a mini lab tomorrow, and I will try to do some more experimentation with the coil this weekend. We do have, by generous contribution of a friend, we have a massive, actually, stereo amp receiver. So we are going to attempt to drive a neodymium sphere with a 200-watt RTM massive car subwoofer. This is going to be insane, right? We're going to need to really be careful here. I can't probably put it up all the way. But with 40 watts, we're nearly getting magnetic synchronicity, where we're taking this fucking sphere like almost a foot outside the torr, where the magnetic field actually is condensed, and it's still spinning, right? I took it down here even, and it was still spinning. So I'm like, if we up the power more, it'll just keep on spinning probably. It won't probably dissipate down here. We'll probably take it outside and just hang out with it. But no, that's going to be really, really cool if we can get it working. But we do have to take a lot of safety precautions because that is a lot of energy. Remember, in comparison, when we ran the Wattman reduction experiment, remember we spin the sphere, we reduce the input wattage because the energy goes back into the system and supplements it, kind of like in a similar way here. That was only using 40 watts on the stereo amp, okay? And we only got it up to like 55 watt input. So, yeah. So 200 watts is, we got to be really careful with that. So, but that's going to be really fun. If we can get that to work, I'm really excited about that one because I've been really, really trying hard to finally crack Daniel Nunez and Jack Scholl's method of magnetically synchronizing the neodymium sphere with the field frequency of the coil. And what I mean by this is you could take it outside like 20 feet and it'll still spin. It's synchronized. So, yeah, there might be some basic level of interaction because the field is very large, but it's not going to be strong enough to spin it. But what's more interesting is they turn off the system and it doesn't slow down. Normally, it would probably just, slow down after you turn it off. No, it starts to speed up because, you do have that transient spike that happens when you turn on and off systems. So there's always that to consider. I'm really interested in testing the theory, the threshold theory I had, because it's my belief that this is possible with almost any proper ABHA coil or vortex coil, as long as you have the proper phase, synchronization, timing, geometry, and input power. That's the key difference here, the threshold of power input. And that has always been a belief that should lead to some more interesting effects. At a specific voltage input, you should see probably more efficiency gain, I'm assuming. So that's very interesting. So we're gonna have a lot of fun with that, but stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe, hit that like button, and let's just read the comments, make sure nobody has any questions before I sign off. Have I checked the actual wattage that runs back into the battery? So there is actually a large amount of energy that's going back into the battery regarding amperage and voltage. Again, there's that negative 168 volts. Apparently that's going back into the battery, but I believe we had a panel turned off. So it's probably closer to like 80 volts going back into the battery. But it's not clean. Remember, it's dirty. It's not clean. And the timing is probably off for the battery to absorb it properly. So we could put that on our list of things to measure for the next lab. We'll do that. We'll measure the current and the voltage going in back into the battery on the negative rail. Well, we'd have to measure the voltage on both rails, but we'll measure the current on the negative rail specifically. And I wanted to use the amp clamp too. Actually, I have the amp clamp right here. We could do that real quick before I sign off. Let's do that. So I took multiple readings, but it does appear, because when I take a reading on the wire in one position, sometimes it appears slightly different than another position regarding the amp clamp. So that's my problem here. It's not consistent, but I am seeing the pattern that I am seeing that is consistent is that we are seeing like 1 to 2 milliamp return higher on the negative, which is interesting. I'm seeing about 308 milliamps on the positive with the amp clamp, and I'm seeing about 311 milliamps on the negative. So that's interesting, right? I think that's interesting. Even if it was completely even, that's interesting. And that really does tell us a lot. You know, the system should be ideally putting back more energy than it's pulling out if you want to close the loop, right? If you want to fully close the loop and power it, not indefinitely, but as long as the parts will last and whatnot, if you want to do that kind of system, you have to have, you know, a net gain of some sort. And it has to overcome the discharge rate. So, you know, you can close the loop partially and it'll slow down the decay rate like we're doing, but it won't be enough to power it indefinitely. So that's what we're working on, though. Hopefully we can get enough energy redirected back to the battery and cleanly that we can hopefully, you know, just power this until, you know, say the transistor burns up or, you know, the neon lamp burns out and you need to replace it. So it's totally possible, in my opinion. If you ask a, you know, electrical engineer, they will laugh at you, though. But, you know, to be honest, this system is doing so many unconventional things that I'm surprised I don't have a whole team in here, like, analyzing it right now. It's kind of laughable to me that nobody is really paying attention to this shit. And it's like some of the most fucking mind-blowing things I've ever seen. And I'm experimenting with it in real life, you know, here, and giving you guys the 411 on it. It's so much fun. and I couldn't be more grateful and blessed to be doing this great work. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. I am going to try to attempt to do a live stream tomorrow and Saturday if possible, but we do have a live stream planned for Sunday with Malcolm Bendel again. He'll be back for the Bendel Report. I think we planned that one for, what do we do, 8 o'clock? Yeah, 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the Bendel Report. This week it's going to be on Sunday. Yeah, tune in. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, everybody. With that, I want to wish you all a very happy night. And I'll see you next time. Peace.
Castaway, alienated from the aids of added nature in disguise. Ideas ahead of time, dismissed with narrow eyes. Benefactor boy, dreaming about the world you can't deploy. Changing the system, but treated like a toy. Ideas misunderstood, but brilliance is his point. Benefactor boy, can't you hear his voice? Talking about 0 point, the points lost on them. Structures crumbling from the same old sim. They laugh like I'm crazy, but I see it all so clear. Exploited labor, unheard, injustice burning ears. Fighting for a change in this wasteland of noise. But they call me foolish while I teach and boys. Benefactor boy, dreaming about the world you can't deploy. Changing the system, but treated like a toy. Ideas misunderstood, but brilliance is his point. Benefactor boy, can't you hear his voice? Revolutions in the darkest nights. A dreamer with vision beneath the laughter and noise. A future so bright waiting for the right choice. Benefactor boy, dreaming about the world you can't deploy. Changing the system.
Damn, you guys didn't remind me about the subscriptions. I was going to give out free subscriptions. You know what? Tune in Sunday for free subscriptions. We'll give them out then on the Bendel Report. How's that? You guys have to remind me, though, or I'll forget.